thanks for the invitation. Thanks for being here. Thanks especially Carlos. When he invited me, I thought this was a good opportunity to say something about the topic I have been working with during many years, but I have some new ideas about this. And so the good part is that what I'm going to present is new. It's something I'm very interested in, something I'm very curious about. The bad part is that it's maybe more fragile because it's in a. I'm just now. Trying to elaborate it. In spite of that, I have to say that I have been working during the last, 20 years in issues related to constitutionalism. So a lot of what I'm going to say, although it's somehow abstract, is very much related and is in a part emerged from research I have been doing the last 20 years. And the discussion has to do with an old topic, which is the tension between constitutionalism and democracy. But I thought I had something, new to say about that. So I will present it. I will present first the more abstract aspect of it, and then I will illustrate what I'm saying with examples coming from the Latin American context. The first idea is this. Just to present very briefly the core of the argument, or the abstract argument. There is a tension between the constitutional idea and the democratic idea. This has been explored during decades. There is this fantastic book for me, edited by Jon Elster, on this tension. That there is all this work he has been doing on pre-commitment with other very good people. But I want to say something particular about that. So when one of the best contributions to the Elster volume and to the discussion in general about constitutionalism and democracy was the work by Stephen Holmes about pre-commitments and the Constitution. So the basic idea was that against those who said that constitutions only dishonor the democratic idea, he wanted to say, Holmes tried to say, that democracy could be helped by constitution. So constitution could be seen as a way of enabling democracy. So maybe So in Holmes' idea, basically the idea is the following: there are rules that can have regulative powers. So, for example, a regulative rule would be not to smoke. And then there are constitutive rules, like, for example, bishops move in diagonal. So, bishops, well, move. Then constitutive rules, like constitution, is also the constitutive rule in the sense that settles the rules of the game. So constitutions, or constitutive rules in general, can be enabling or disabling, and this applies particularly to the Constitution. So in the traditional discussion between the tensions between democracy and constitution, so a common argument was that constitutions basically disable democracy, because this was, for example, Thomas Paine idea or Thomas Jefferson idea. So when they say, for example, every generation needs to regulate itself, no generation can bind the next one, So that was a way to say we should be very much aware of those rules established by our predecessors who want to prevent us to act freely in the future. So there was a current that, in a way, what Holmes called the Paine-Jefferson position expressed, that say that constitutions may be seen or should be seen as a threat to democracy, as a way to put unacceptable limits to democracy. And Holmes and other people, so I don't know, Elster, in his work on Ulysses, was also here. So there was a line of work that people like Holmes promoted, saying that rules should not be seen just in that word, but that constitution should be basically conceived of as enabling rules. Why? Because there are certain rules, and this applies to the example of Ulysses and the sirens, that there are certain limitations that may promote freedom. So a constitution would be that, or could be seen in that way, in the sense that a constitution could establish certain limitations in time one in order to gain freedom in time two, in the same way that Ulysses, in time one, tied his hands to the mast in order to gain freedom in time two. So the example of Ulysses, what it says was, it came to say, well, it's not that limitations should be always seen, or basically seen, as ways of losing freedom. So these seem to be derived from this position, that we should be very much aware of the power and the limits established by regulations. So, but the Ulysses examples came to see, well, no, what happened with Ulysses? It's true, he tied his hand, but he was very well aware in time one that in time two there were the sirens, and then he wanted to change the route of the boat, but that would prevent him to arrive where he wanted to arrive. I mean, so to a safe end, and so tying his hands in time one allowed him the freedom to fulfill his objective and arrive to time three. So this is a kind of the evolution that had this discussion. I think the contribution by people like Elster or Holmes were extremely important in the sense of enriching our way of thinking about those issues. But against this view, I want to insist on the idea that the constitutions, it's true that they may have this enabling power, these enabling capacities, but I want to say that we should still see them, and particularly when we focus on what happened in actual history, we should still see them basically as ways of disabling democracy. Just as a footnote, you know that Elster, a few years after he wrote this famous book on Ulysses, wrote another book criticizing himself. The book was called Ulysses Unbound, and so basically saying, well, after I talked to historians, I don't think this is so much like that. And in a way, what I'm going to say has to do with that. So the idea that would be this. In time one, and I'm thinking basically about constitutions created in the Americas, I would say, I mean, this applies broadly, but basically I will be thinking about the case of the United States and Latin America. So in time one in Latin America, these constitutions, in the case of the United States, at the end of the 18th century, in the case of Latin America, in the mid-19th century, these constitutions were obviously, openly created under a paradigm which was a quite elitist paradigm, aristocratic paradigm, a way of thinking that was very much, I would say, distrustful of democracy, hostile to what we understand today of democracy. Then, as a result of that, I mean, what the constitutions did at that time, so the institutions that were built into the constitutions were institutions that reflected those assumptions, and I want to show that, or to say something more about that. So the institutions that were adopted, that were built into the constitutions, reflected those elitist assumptions. And in time 3, what we have is that, of course, I mean, we cannot think about the constitutions today as they were, thought in the moment they were created. Of course, that now we interpret the constitution with new paradigms, etc., etc. But the truth is that there was I would say, so in time 1, constitutions were adopted, I would say, at least in most American countries, under this aristocratic paradigm, so a kind of elitist paradigm. And then it came, I would say, a democratic explosion, that it came, little by little, probably events like the 1848 revolutions in Europe, or this, what they call a new democratic conscience. The idea that we have the right to vote, we have the right to participate in politics. So it came in different events, and this I can put in between brackets, but I assume that it happened, what I call like a democratic explosion. So a democratic awareness. Jeremy Waldron talked, and also in a way John Rawls talked about what he says, what he calls the fact of pluralism, and what Jeremy Waldron calls the fact of disagreement. What characterizes our time is the fact that we disagree in plural society. For me, the fact of the time would be the fact of democracy, our awareness or our consciousness about democracy, and our demand that we have the right to participate, we have the right to take part in the collective decision-making procedures, we have a say, our right to participate should be recognized. So for me, the fact of the time, more than the fact of pluralism, of the fact of disagreement, the fact of pluralism, Rawls was talking about that, Waldron was talking about the fact of disagreement. For me, the fact of democracy, the fact that we demand democracy, we demand for our right to participate actively in the daily life of our communities. So I want to say that our constitutions remain the same, and the institutions remain the same after this democratic explosion, and that is a serious fact. And so in part what I have been doing, the research I have been doing in the last 20 years, and this was more focused on Latin America, but I could say also something about the US Constitution and other constitutions in the world, is that there were some significant changes, but the changes were basically concentrated in the area of rights. So what I call I wrote a book, I published a book a couple of years ago called the engine room of the Constitution, the sala de máquinas de Constitución. So basically saying that there were lots of changes adopted during the 20th century, but those changes were basically directed at the declarations of rights. So in Latin America, we have all this spectacular list of social, economic, cultural, multicultural, human rights, spectacular. But those changes have not been consistent with changes in the same direction, in the same democratic, social, progressive, whatever direction in the engine room of the Constitution, so in the organization of power. So the point was of that, all the line of writings I have been doing, or research I have been doing, is that we have lots of changes at the level of our basic rules, at the level of our Constitution, but those changes were concentrated in the area of rights, and basically our institutions remain the same. So for me that's the crucial point, which is, this means that our organization of power, and here when I say we, I speak about Latin America, but also speak about the United States, and I would say it goes beyond that, but basically for the Americas, the constitutions we have are still showing an organization of power that has been built according to the assumptions that were dominant at the end of the 18th century in the United States, which were all these assumptions about I would say, aristocracy, this view that was very much hostile to democracy. So the core of our institutions still reflect those agreements, and in my book I say that the organic part of the Latin American Constitution, so the engine room of the Constitution, still reflect what was the compact between liberals and conservative forces during the mid-19th century, which were the two basic dominant elites in most Latin American countries, in Colombia, in Peru, in Chile, in Argentina. So our basic institution, the core of our institution, still reflect that agreement, that elitist agreement. So the point is, of course, again, today we interpret the Constitution under a new paradigm. Today we approach to the Constitution under a new paradigm. The basic, and now I will go a little with some details to the different, main principle or institutions in our Constitution. So, of course, there is a lot of changes in the way we interpret these things. So, just a little story. The same Stephen Holmes and other people with whom I work, for example, Kazanstein, and many others, so they interpret the notion of the checks and balances under this new democratic paradigm, and they say, for example, well, no matter how this was conceived, the system of checks and balances now can contribute and tend to contribute to our democratic discussion, and that for me is part of the problem. I would say, well, of course there are changes, but the machine remained the same, and this organic part remained the same. So let me say, let me make reference to 5-7 points. I can go very briefly, depending on how much time I have, but basically saying different aspects of our constitutional organization that still reflect that old way of thinking about the Constitution. So first I would say the understanding of representation that is built into the Constitution. Again, I would say that there are different ways to approach to the notion of representation, but basically I would say there was a more democratic, I would say, approach to representation conceive of representation as a second best ideal, as a necessary evil, and then there was another approach. So representation, another approach that saw representation basically in terms of separation, independence between those elected and the people at large. So if you work with the first paradigm, I would call it the more democratic paradigm. So the idea would be, every time you have the chance, you have to go to some, you have to try democratic participation, you have to open a consultation in one way or another, dialogue in one way or another to the people, because representation is a necessary evil, so every time you have the chance to escape from that, you have to resort to a more open democratic approach. If you are with with the second paradigm, which I would call the elitist paradigm, of course not, because as Madison said, so this is a line in the Federalist number 10, and it's not an isolated line, it's a core line. It's basically saying that representatives have more chances to discover the goods for the country that the people themselves call for that purpose. So if you understand representation in this way, so not as a second chance, as a necessary evil, but as a first option, then of course you don't want to open chances to political participation when it's possible. So I would say this is one first consequence, that our constitutions have chosen this kind of understanding of representation, and that is reflected in the institutions we built into our constitution. Second, the preference for what I call, or what Madison called, endogenous or internal controls. O'Donnell also talked about internal control, horizontal control, versus exogenous or popular controls. So our constitutions reflect a clear choice for endogenous controls vis-a-vis exogenous controls. I can give more details about but let me enumerate them. The choice for a system of checks and balances. Well, this is a particular understanding of how to think about the connections, the relationship between the different branches of power. So the more democratic alternative was presenting what it was called at the time a strict separation of power. This was a kind of Rousseauian approach to separation of power, because basically the idea is the different branches should work independently, and this means that we will have an independent legislative branch, which is, for obvious reasons, is going to be the more powerful of all. But the idea of checks and balances basically denies that and says, no, all the different branches of powers should have an equivalent powers. This is a very undemocratic idea because it assumes that the more popular branch of government should be having a similar, say, defensive tool as all the other. So the idea would be like you have the executive, the judiciary, the legislative, and all of them have some defensive tools, like they all have similar guns, so they all have similar threatening powers, and that is going to give us equilibrium. Well, but this idea of the equilibrium of the checks and balances, which first is very different from the idea of strict separation of powers, implies that the democratic branch of government, or the more democratic branch of government, is going to have a very similar threatening power than the other branches, which are not, or they are not supposed to have this democratic representation. So, in the sense, so the idea of representation, the idea of endogenous controls, the idea of checks and balances, well, of course, the judiciary and the idea of impartiality that is built or is related to this. So, again, there are two understandings of impartial decision. One is very Habermasian understanding of impartiality. Impartiality has to do with an open discussion where all those potentially affected intervene or participate. The elitist paradigm, which was the dominant paradigm, the idea was the opposite, not collective reflection, but individual reflection of those best prepared people in isolation from the debate at large. So again, you have two understandings of impartiality, and the institutional expression of that is the kind of judiciary we created, because the judiciary is created not under the idea that has to contribute in a collective dialogue where all intervene in the discussion about the basic fundamental issues. No, it's the opposite. It's the basic truth, the basic rights are best protected by the judiciary because they have the time, the isolation, the separation to reflect properly about the fundamental issues. So our conception about the judiciary is derived from this, I would say, very elitist understanding of impartiality. By the way, this is very much related to how rights are conceived in this tradition. So this derives from the idea, again, rights could be conceived in two different ways at least. One, very much related to the idea that, if you want a Kermanian idea, rights are the emergent of a collective discussion, so they express our more fundamental agreements. The alternative understanding of rights would be, no, rights like in the tradition of natural rights, like in the Lockean tradition. Like some natural rights that in a way we discover, and so we need people who are best located and best prepared to understand, I mean, what rights are about, and so why right matters and what it means to protect rights. So these are, again, two very different understanding of rights. This, I would say, is still the dominant paradigm. Again, if you want, this is a favorite topic for me, but again, this is very clear, the tensions between this understanding and democracy. So still today, judges from this paradigm say, I mean, and this is very clear at all levels, at the US Supreme Court or the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, is saying, basically the idea is, rights have nothing to do with democracy, don't mess rights with democracy. Democracy should not be able to interfere with rights, and the rights are in a way our domain, so we are controlling what the scope, the limits, the implications, everything about rights. So two very different understanding of rights. And just to conclude, I mean, I would say there are at least two, I would say, specificities that belong to the Latin American approach to constitutionalism, which, I mean, I think that derive from this, or are very much, I mean, related to this scheme. I mean, in Latin America, constitutions derive, I would say, in the vast majority of cases, come from the model of the US, with some basic little variations. But there are two aspects that are very typical of Latin American constitutionalism within the framework of constitutions that are very much US-style constitutions. But there are two, I mean, main variations, I would say. One had to do with the executive power, which is what Carlos Nino called hyper-presidentialist. Well, this, again, is also another spectacular topic, and also for those interested in democracy, and in terms of thinking about Latin America today, I mean, the fact that progressive forces have been backing super hyper presidents in the name of democracy. Well, of course that the democracy, I mean, we need to define democracy, and I'm happy to define democracy, but I didn't want to go into the details, not to complicate things unnecessarily. I mean, I have my own approach to democracy, but I don't think it's necessary to go as far as I would go if I define democracy, say, in connection to a more dialogical or conversational approach. But with a basic understanding of democracy, it should be obvious that there is a tension or a contradiction between a democratic understanding of how we should organize together and hyper-presidentialism. In every reasonable understanding of democracy, democracy has to do with decentralization of power. Well, hyper-presidentialism is just the opposite, and that's a very Latin American phenomenon. In my work, I relate this again with this compact that was typical in the mid-19th centuries in Latin America. I mean, where, if you want, liberal and conservative demand came together. So while liberal push for a kind of typical US model, checks and balances model, that was kind of the typical liberal demand in constitutional conventions, well, then the conservative forces say no way, and so their model was a more monarchical model. So hyper-presidentialism is a result of that agreement between liberal and conservative forces. So liberals wanted the checks and balances, and conservatives wanted a more monarchical government. So the result of those forces, of that compact, was a hyper-presidentialist system that want to preserve the system of checks and balances, giving conservatives what they want. So, in a way, I would say, making a tremendous contradiction. I mean, as a few minutes ago, I criticized, or I suggest a criticism to the idea of checks and balances, this idea, in a way, of providing each branch of power with a similar threatening gun, or a similar tool for threatening the other branches. And that's bad, but even it's much worse when you break the whole thing, giving the executive a much powerful gun. Because now you have a disbalanced system of checks and balances where the executive has the capacity to threaten the others in ways that the others cannot reply. So that distorts the whole thing. So they, in a way, they destabilize the system of checks and balances from the first minute. So the alternative solution, or the alternative Latin American proposal in the face of checks and balances, is problematic in democratic terms. The Latin American response to this, I would say, is make things much worse because it destroyed what this system had of interest, which was, well, we tried to find an equilibrium between the different forces. So the Latin American hyper-presidentialism, I would say, distorts improperly the system of checks and balances. So that's a Latin American peculiarity. The other peculiarity has to do with this long list of social rights that began in Mexico in 1917 and what then, diffused in all Latin American constitutions, from the Chilean constitution, which finally adopted a very modest approach to social rights, to other much more demanding constitutions like the Brazilian constitution or the Colombian constitution, in part the Argentinian constitution that, with the last reform, Argentina, for example, gave constitutional level to all the human rights treaties signed by Argentina. So now they all have constitutional status, all those treaties, which is, in a way, is a nightmare. One would say, well, fine, we have all those rights, but it makes a mess, but it's okay. But I don't want to make fun of that. I think there are reasons to say, well, if you want more rights, make them explicit, that's fine. But the problem, I think, again, is that how those social rights have been integrated into the Constitution. So they have been integrated in ways that preserve, untouch, unmodify, as I said, the organic part of the Constitution. So now we have Constitution that in most cases have one of the two parts of the Constitution, so the part related to the Declaration of Rights, which have all this spectacular list of rights. So, like our constitutions have two souls. One is very much progressive, democratic, social, advanced, 20th century, if you want, part of the Constitution, but this is all denied by the other part of the Constitution, which is the most important part of the Constitution, which is the organization of power, which, if the part related to rights is like 21st century style, the organic part, as I said, is 18th century style. So, of course, they don't get along well, and of course, there are then lots of tension between those spectacular promises you make with one hand and which you deny with the other. Just as a footnote, I think one of the most important political constitutional problems in contemporary Latin America had to do with that, because we had presidents which were daily challenged by the same rights they had promoted to include in the Constitution. So you have super powerful presidents that were challenged because, say, I don't know, Bolivia today or Ecuador a few months ago, the people want to put in practice, put in motion some of the spectacular advanced clauses included in the Constitution, and they have the problem of the presidential veto that says no. People say, well, we have the right to discuss and decide whether we accept or not a new mining company in our land. While the president, no, this is not going to be discussed. So the two parts of the constitutions are in tension, and that's a very serious problem. But so that for me are two peculiarities, two things that are very typical in Latin America, but belong to a long list of problems that are there in the Constitution. So as I said, this is just some initial exploratory ideas that are related to a long, period research about American constitutionalism. So the point, just to summarize and conclude, is that our constitutions, as it said in the metaphor of the engine room of the constitutions, our constitutions still, in the main part, in the central part, are still very much created under the assumptions, presumptions, prejudices that were typical in the late 18th century, when the assumptions about democracy were, I would say, radically different from those we share today. So our constitutions have not been changed according to the new democratic paradigm that since the mid-19th century and every time, even stronger, have been coming to dominate our age, which I would characterize by what I call the fact of democracy. So our constitutions are not being modified by this new democratic understanding, this new democratic conscience that we all share. And so the point is, well, of course I understand that there are new interpretations, that the things, that the old things can be somehow rearranged, I mean, to work differently in the new age, but the point is that those elitist assumptions were built into the Constitution and are still there, and I think they are still creating problems for our new democratic consciousness.